The smoke rising from Millfield's town square carried more than the scent of burning wood. It carried the weight of fear, superstition, and a hatred so deep it had festered in the hearts of good people until they could no longer tell the difference between justice and vengeance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Whitmore pressed her face against the cold iron bars of her cell window, watching the flames dance higher into the autumn sky. They were building her pyre piece by piece, log by log, each addition accompanied by the jeers of townspeople, who had once bought herbs from her garden and praised her healing touch. Now those same hands that had blessed her work pointed accusingly through the jail's stone walls. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 months ago, she had saved the mayor's daughter from a fever that threatened to claim the child's life. The tincture Margaret had brewed from elderflower and willow bark had broken the fever within hours. Mayor Thomas Brennan had wept with gratitude, pressing silver coins into her palm despite her protests that healing was not something to be bought and sold. But gratitude, she had learned, was as fragile as morning frost. Everything changed the night Reverend Isaiah Morse arrived in Millfield. He came with letters of recommendation from eastern cities, speaking of divine missions and the Lord's work against the forces of darkness. His sermons drew crowds from 3 counties over, people hungry for certainty in an uncertain world. Morse spoke with the kind of conviction that made doubt feel like sin itself. Margaret had attended his first service out of curiosity, sitting in the back pew with her worn shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She watched as the Reverend's pale eyes swept across the congregation like a hawk searching for prey. When his gaze lingered on her weathered hands, stained green from years of working with medicinal plants, she felt something cold settle in her stomach. "There are serpents among us," Morse had declared that Sunday, his voice rising above the rafters. "Wolves in sheep's clothing who practice the devil's arts under the guise of charity. They offer healing, but at what cost? They brew potions in darkness and whisper incantations over their fires. The Lord commands us to suffer, not a witch to live." Margaret had left before the final hymn, but the damage was already done. Seeds of suspicion, once planted in fertile minds, grew faster than weeds. The first sign came when Martha Henley, the baker's wife, crossed the street rather than pass Margaret's cottage. Then Samuel Rodriguez stopped bringing his children to her when they fell ill with winter coughs. The weekly market visits became exercises in isolation as conversations died when she approached and eyes turned away from her offerings of dried herbs and healing salves. But it was the arrival of young Emma Patterson that sealed Margaret's fate. Girl had appeared at Margaret's door on a night when the October wind howled through the valley like a banshee. No more than 16, with tangled auburn hair and eyes wide with terror, Emma collapsed on the threshold, bleeding from wounds that spoke of unspeakable cruelty. Margaret hadn't hesitated. She'd pulled the girl inside, tended her injuries, and fed her hot broth by the fire. Emma stayed for 3 days, slowly regaining her strength while sharing fragments of her story. She had fled from an arranged marriage to a man twice her age, a brute who had beaten her for refusing his advances. Her own father had sold her to settle gambling debts, caring more for cards than his daughter's welfare. With nowhere else to turn, she had run into the wilderness, following stories of a kind woman who lived at the forest's edge. Margaret gave Emma clean clothes, a pouch of silver coins, and directions to the next town where distant relatives might take her in. She watched the girl disappear into the morning mist, hoping she would find the freedom that had been stolen from her. 3 days later, Reverend Morse stood before his congregation holding a blood-stained piece of fabric. "This belonged to Emma Patterson," he announced, his voice heavy with manufactured grief. "The girl who vanished from her father's house last week. Found at the edge of Demon's Hollow, torn from her dress as she tried to escape some unspeakable horror. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as she realized what was happening. From her seat in the back, she could see heads turning, whispers spreading like wildfire through the pews. The Reverend's eyes found hers across the crowded sanctuary, and she saw the trap that had been carefully constructed around her. "We must ask ourselves," Morse continued, "who benefits from the disappearance of an innocent child? Who dwells closest to the places where darkness gathers? Who practices arts that honest folk cannot understand?" The accusations came swift and merciless. Emma's father, desperate to deflect attention from his own failings, swore he had seen his daughter heading toward Margaret's cottage the night she vanished. The Reverend spoke of unnatural healing, of herbs that worked too well to be anything but devil's magic. Witnesses emerged from the woodwork, each adding their own embellishments to the growing legend of Margaret's supposed wickedness. They claimed she had been seen dancing naked under the full moon, that her garden grew too green, her remedies worked too quickly, that animals behaved strangely in her presence, and that she had been heard speaking to invisible spirits in the darkness. Each accusation built upon the last until the woman who had spent her life healing others was transformed into a monster of their own creation. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted less than an hour. Judge Cornelius Wade, a man whose own wife had died from a fever Margaret couldn't cure years earlier, presided over the proceedings with barely concealed satisfaction. The evidence was circumstantial at best, built on fear and superstition rather than fact. But in a town consumed by religious fervor, facts mattered little. Margaret was given no opportunity to defend herself, no chance to explain that Emma had left alive and well. Her protests fell on deaf ears as witness after witness stood to testify against her. The baker's wife claimed her bread had spoiled after Margaret touched it. The blacksmith swore his horses shied away from her presence. Even children were brought forward to repeat stories they had been coached to tell. The verdict was unanimous: guilty of witchcraft and trafficking with the devil. Now, as she watched the pyre grow larger outside her window, Margaret wondered if Emma had made it safely to her relatives. She hoped the girl was far from Millfield, far from the madness that had consumed a once peaceful town. At least her death would mean something if it had purchased Emma's freedom. The sun was setting behind the mountains when she heard the footsteps in the corridor outside her cell. Heavy boots accompanied by the jangle of keys and the low murmur of men preparing for an execution. Margaret straightened her shoulders and smoothed her simple brown dress. If she was to die, she would meet death with dignity. Sheriff Daniel Morrison appeared first, his weathered face grim with the duty ahead. Behind him came two deputies, their young faces pale with the weight of what they were about to do. At the rear walked Reverend Morse, his black coat flapping like a raven's wing, Bible clutched in his white-knuckled grip. "It's time, Miss Whitmore," Morrison said quietly. He had known Margaret for 20 years, had brought his own children to her when they were sick. The shame in his eyes was almost harder to bear than the hatred of the mob outside. Margaret nodded, stepping away from the window. "I'm ready, Daniel." Morse stepped forward, his pale eyes glittering with righteous fervor. "Have you any final words? Any confession that might ease your passage to judgment?" Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I have spent my life healing the sick and comforting the suffering. If that is the devil's work, then your God is not the loving Father you claim him to be." The Reverend's face twisted with anger, but before he could respond, Sheriff Morrison placed the iron shackles around Margaret's wrists. The metal was cold against her skin, but she didn't flinch. She had endured worse pain in her 38 years of life. They led her through the jailhouse corridors, past cells that held common criminals who watched her passage with a mixture of curiosity and pity. These men, guilty of theft and violence and drunkenness, seemed to understand that a greater injustice was being carried out than any crime they had committed. The main door of the jailhouse opened, and Margaret was hit by a wall of sound. Hundreds of voices raised in righteous fury, calling for her blood. The town square was packed with people who had traveled from miles around to witness the execution. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, mothers held babies close, and merchants hawked meat pies and ale as if this were a carnival rather than a murder. The pyre stood in the center of the square like a wooden mountain, logs stacked with careful precision to ensure a hot, consuming fire. A thick wooden post rose from its center, iron chains hanging from crude brackets. At the base of the pyre, bundles of kindling had been soaked in pitch to guarantee quick ignition. Margaret walked toward her death with her head high, ignoring the garbage thrown at her feet and the curses hurled like stones. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. But as she drew closer to the pyre, a movement at the edge of her vision caught her attention. At the far end of the square, barely visible in the gathering darkness, a lone rider sat motionless on horseback. The figure was too distant to make out clearly, but something about the way he held himself sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. He seemed to be watching the proceedings with an intensity that set him apart from the bloodthirsty crowd. Then the sheriff's hand was on her arm, guiding her up the wooden steps that led to the top of the pyre. Each step brought her closer to the flames that would consume her flesh and the mob that would celebrate her death. Yet somehow, knowing that one person in this sea of hatred might be bearing witness to the injustice gave her a strange kind of comfort. The rough wood of the post scraped against her back as the deputies chained her arms behind her. The iron bit into her wrists, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the anguish of seeing her neighbors and friends transformed into a mob crying for her blood. Reverend Morse climbed the steps with theatrical solemnity, his Bible raised high above his head. "Behold," he cried, his voice carrying across the packed square, "the wages of sin. Let this serve as a warning to all who would traffic with darkness." He began to read from Scripture, his voice rising and falling with practiced rhythm, but Margaret barely heard the words. Her attention was fixed on the mysterious rider who had somehow moved closer without her noticing. He now sat at the edge of the crowd, still as a statue, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There was something about him that seemed familiar, though she was certain they had never met. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, with a quietness that spoke of dangerous competence. Or perhaps it was simply her mind, desperate for any distraction from the horror of her situation, conjuring phantoms where none existed. The Reverend finished his recitation and stepped back, nodding to Sheriff Morrison. The time had come. Morrison descended the pyre with heavy steps, a burning torch in his hand. The crowd fell silent, hundreds of eyes fixed on the flame that would end Margaret Whitmore's life. Even the children stopped their chatter, sensing the gravity of the moment. "Any last words?" Morrison called up to her, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret looked out over the sea of faces, these people she had known and served and loved despite their flaws. In the flickering torchlight, she could see the fear that drove their hatred, the superstition that poisoned their hearts. They were not evil people, simply frightened ones who had been led astray by a man who fed on their terror. "I forgive you," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "All of you." Some in the crowd shifted uncomfortably at her words, but Reverend Morse's voice boomed over any stirring of conscience. "Do not let her devil's tongue deceive you. Light the fire." Sheriff Morrison raised the torch, and Margaret closed her eyes, preparing for the end. But as the flame touched the pitch-soaked kindling, a sound cut through the night that made every person in the square freeze. Where they stood, the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed off the surrounding buildings, followed immediately by another. Then another. Screams erupted from the crowd as people dove for cover. Not knowing where the shots were coming from, or who was firing them, Margaret's eyes snapped open to see chaos erupting around her. The mysterious rider had vanished from his position at the edge of the crowd, but the shots continued to ring out with deadly precision. She watched in amazement as the torch flew from Sheriff Morrison's hand, extinguished before it could fully ignite the pyre. Through the smoke and confusion, she caught glimpses of a figure moving through the crowd with lethal efficiency. The man's face remained hidden, but his purpose was clear. He was fighting his way toward the pyre, toward her, cutting down anyone who stood in his path. The Reverend's voice rose above the chaos, calling for order, demanding that the execution proceed. But his words were lost in the thunder of gunfire and the screams of people fleeing for their lives. The righteous mob that had come to see a witch burn was dissolving into a panicked mass of humanity seeking only to escape the violence that had erupted in their midst. Margaret watched it all from her chains, suspended between death and salvation, as an unknown gunslinger fought through fire and blood to reach her. Whether he would arrive in time and what price he would pay for her life remained to be seen. But for the first time in months, Margaret Whitmore dared to hope. The gunslinger moved through the chaos like a phantom born from smoke and gunpowder. His name was Jonas Clay, though no one in Millfield knew it, and he hadn't spoken a word aloud in 7 years. The silence that surrounded him was not born of choice, but of necessity, carved from his throat by a Confederate saber during the last days of a war that had stolen everything he held dear. Jonas had been tracking 3 men across 4 states when he'd stumbled upon the witch trial. The outlaws he pursued had no connection to Millfield or its troubles, but something about the woman chained to that pyre had stopped him cold. Perhaps it was the dignity with which she faced her death, or the way she had forgiven a crowd baying for her blood. More likely, it was the familiar taste of injustice that hung in the air like acrid smoke. He had seen enough innocent people die to last a dozen lifetimes. The first shot had taken down Deputy Marcus Flynn, the young man's rifle spinning from his hands as Jonas's bullet shattered his shoulder. Flynn collapsed behind an overturned merchant's cart, clutching his wound and screaming for his mother. The boy would live, which was more mercy than he deserved for participating in this travesty. Jonas's second shot splintered the wooden support beam holding up the preacher's platform. Reverend Morse tumbled backward into the crowd, his Bible flying from his grasp as he scrambled for cover among his panicked congregation. The man's pale eyes searched desperately for the source of the gunfire, but Jonas remained a shadow moving between buildings, invisible to those who sought to stop him. Sheriff Morrison had drawn his weapon and was shouting orders that no one could hear over the screaming crowd. Jonas watched the older man for a moment, recognizing something in his bearing that spoke of reluctant duty rather than righteous zeal. Morrison had clearly known the accused woman, had perhaps even cared for her, but had been caught between the law and his conscience. Such men deserved pity more than bullets. The third shot took the gun from Morrison's hand without harming him, sending the weapon clattering across the cobblestones. The sheriff stumbled backward, staring at his empty palm in shock, then looked up to meet Jonas's eyes across the chaotic square. For a moment, time seemed suspended between them. Morrison saw something in the gunslinger's gaze that made him step aside rather than reach for his backup weapon. Understanding passed between them without words. One man who had failed to protect an innocent would not stand in the way of another who might succeed. The crowd was thinning rapidly as people fled down side streets and into buildings, seeking shelter from the gunfire. Parents scooped up crying children while merchants abandoned their stalls and ran for cover. The bloodthirsty mob that had come to witness a burning was revealing its true nature in the face of real danger. They were cowards who enjoyed cruelty only when it was safe, but not everyone had fled. Kill him. Reverend Morse's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. The preacher had regained his footing and was pointing frantically in Jonas's direction. He's in league with the witch. The devil has sent his own champion. 3 men stepped forward at the Reverend's call, their weapons already drawn. Jonas recognized the type immediately, hired guns, who had drifted into town for the spectacle and stayed for the promise of easy money. Men like this always gathered around zealots like flies on carrion, eager to profit from other people's hatred. The first gunman, a scarred brute named Tobias Kane, raised his rifle toward the shadowy figure moving between the buildings. But Jonas was already moving, rolling behind a horse trough as bullets splintered the wood where he had been standing. Water exploded from the perforated metal, mixing with the blood already staining the cobblestones. Jonas came up firing, his Colt Navy revolver speaking with deadly precision. Kane's rifle flew from his hands as a bullet shattered his wrist, sending him to his knees with a howl of pain. The second gunman, a younger man with dead eyes and quick hands, managed to get off 2 shots before Jonas's return fire caught him in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him face first into the dirt. The third hired gun, showing more wisdom than his companions, decided that whatever the Reverend was paying wasn't worth dying for. He threw down his weapon and ran, disappearing into the maze of side streets that led away from the square. Through it all, Margaret Whitmore remained chained to her post, watching the battle rage around her with a mixture of awe and terror. The mysterious gunslinger was fighting with a skill that bordered on supernatural, but he was vastly outnumbered. More armed men were emerging from buildings around the square, drawn by the Reverend's promises of reward for the witch's savior's death. Jonas saw them coming and knew his time was running short. He had perhaps minutes before the noose of enemies tightened around him, cutting off any hope of reaching the woman or escaping alive. But as he prepared to make his final desperate charge toward the pyre, an unexpected voice called out across the square, "Stop this madness!" Dr. Benjamin Cross stepped into the open, his medical bag in one hand and his other raised for peace. The elderly physician had delivered half the children in Millfield and tended the sick for over 30 years. His word carried weight that even Reverend Morse couldn't easily dismiss. "That woman saved my granddaughter's life last winter," Cross declared, his voice carrying clearly in this sudden lull of gunfire. "She's no more a witch than any of you. This is murder, plain and simple, and I'll not stand by and watch it happen. The devil speaks through her defenders." Morse snarled back, but Jonas could hear the uncertainty creeping into the preacher's voice. Cross's intervention had given some in the crowd pause, reminding them of their own experiences with Margaret's healing touch. "She cured my boy of the lung fever," called out James Mitchell, the town's carpenter. "Wouldn't take a penny for it." "Neither. Fixed my Martha's twisted ankle when she fell from the loft," added Samuel Rodriguez, his voice shaking with guilt. "Said healing was God's work, not hers." More voices began to rise from the remaining crowd, a growing chorus of people remembering kindnesses they had chosen to forget in their fever for blood. The spell of hatred that Reverend Morse had woven around the town was beginning to fray, unraveling thread by thread as conscience reasserted itself. But Morse wasn't finished. The preacher's face had turned purple with rage as he watched his carefully orchestrated execution dissolving into doubt and recrimination. Years of planning and manipulation were crumbling before his eyes, and he wouldn't allow it. "Lies," he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "All lies planted by the witch's corrupted magic. She has bewitched you all, made you forget her true nature. The fire will burn away her deceptions." He snatched up the fallen torch and began climbing toward the pyre himself, his black coat billowing behind him like the wings of a vengeful angel. His eyes had taken on a wild gleam that spoke of madness dressed in righteous clothing. If no one else would light the fire, he would do it himself. Jonas saw the preacher's intention and broke from cover, sprinting across the open square with bullets whining past his ears. Some of the remaining gunmen were still loyal to Morse's coin, and they sent a withering volley of shots in the running man's direction. Jonas felt the heat of a bullet part his hair and another tug at his coat sleeve, but he didn't slow down. He reached the base of the pyre just as Morse touched the torch to the pitch-soaked kindling. Flames immediately began to lick upward, sending acrid smoke into the night air. Margaret coughed as the smoke reached her, but her eyes remained fixed on the gunslinger who had risked everything to reach her. Jonas holstered his empty revolver and drew the knife from his boot, a wicked blade that had served him well in countless fights. He began climbing the pyre even as flames started to spread among the lower logs, the heat already becoming uncomfortable against his face and hands. "You're too late." Morse laughed maniacally from the opposite side of the burning structure. "The fire has been lit. The witch will burn." But Jonas had reached Margaret's side, his knife already working at the iron chains that bound her to the post. The metal was old and had been weakened by years of weather. Under his determined assault, the links began to part one by one. The smoke was getting thicker now, and the heat was becoming dangerous. Flames were climbing higher up the pyre, and Jonas could feel his clothes beginning to smolder. But he didn't stop working, didn't even pause to cough as the acrid smoke filled his lungs. Margaret looked into his eyes as he worked to free her, seeing something there that she recognized. This was a man who understood suffering, who had walked through his own fires and emerged scarred but unbroken. She had seen that look in her mirror too many times not to recognize it in another. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "Why are you doing this?" Jonas paused in his work for just a moment, meeting her gaze. When he opened his mouth, no sound emerged, but she understood anyway. Some debts could only be paid forward, some wrongs could only be righted by preventing new ones. He had failed to save someone once, and that failure had carved the silence from his throat and the purpose into his soul. The last chain parted under his blade, and Margaret fell forward into his arms. But their escape route was already cut off. The lower portion of the pyre was now fully engulfed in flames, and the heat was becoming unbearable. They were trapped on a burning mountain with no way down. That's when Jonas did something that surprised even himself. He threw back his head, and for the first time in 7 years, forced sound from his damaged throat. It came out as little more than a rasp, but it was enough to be heard over the roar of flames. "Horse!" He managed to croak, the word tearing at his throat like broken glass. Across the square, his black stallion, trained to respond to hand signals and whistles that Jonas could no longer make, heard its master's voice and immediately charged toward the burning pyre. The horse was a magnificent animal, a veteran of countless battles who feared neither fire nor gunshot. It had carried Jonas through the hell of war and the chaos of the frontier, and it wouldn't fail him now. The stallion leaped over the lower flames and landed on a section of the pyre that hadn't yet caught fire. Jonas lifted Margaret onto the horse's back, then swung up behind her. But as they prepared to leap free of the burning structure, Reverend Morse appeared at the edge of their platform, a derringer in his hand and madness blazing in his eyes. "If I can't have the witch," he snarled, "then no one can." He raised the small pistol toward Margaret's head, his finger tightening on the trigger. But Jonas was already moving, throwing himself between the gun and the woman. The derringer cracked, and Jonas felt the bullet tear through his shoulder, spinning him around and nearly unseating him from the horse. But he didn't fall. Pain was an old friend, and he had ridden with worse wounds than this. With his good arm, he drew his remaining pistol and put a bullet between Reverend Morse's eyes. The preacher's body tumbled backward into the flames, his black coat catching fire as he fell. Jonas spurred the stallion forward, and the magnificent animal gathered itself and leaped clear of the burning pyre. They sailed through the smoke-filled air for what seemed like an eternity before landing hard on the cobblestones beyond the flames. The horse stumbled but kept its feet, carrying its double burden away from the inferno that had nearly claimed them both. Behind them, the pyre burned like a beacon against the night sky, but it would consume only wood and the body of a madman. The woman they had tried to murder rode free, carried to safety by a man who had found his voice again, just in time to save them both. As they reached the edge of the square, Jonas felt Margaret's arms tighten around his waist. She was holding onto him not just for balance, but for comfort. They were both survivors now, marked by fire but not destroyed by it. The real test would come when the flames died down, and the town had to reckon with what it had almost done. But for now, they rode into the darkness together, leaving behind the light of burning hatred and heading toward an uncertain but hopeful dawn. The abandoned mill stood like a skeleton against the star-scattered sky, its broken water wheel silent after years of neglect. Jonas guided his stallion through the overgrown path that led to the crumbling structure, his wounded shoulder throbbing with each step the horse took. Behind him, Margaret held tight to his waist, her body trembling from shock and the cold night air that bit through her torn dress. They had ridden hard for 2 hours, putting distance between themselves and the chaos they'd left behind in Millfield. Jonas knew the town would organize a pursuit come daylight, but for now they had darkness as their ally. The mill had served as his temporary camp for the past week while he'd tracked the outlaws who had led him to this place. It wasn't much, but it offered shelter and concealment. Jonas dismounted carefully, favoring his wounded shoulder, then reached up to help Margaret down from the horse. Her legs buckled the moment her feet touched the ground, and he caught her before she could fall. The ordeal had taken more out of her than either of them had realized. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "I don't know what's wrong with me." Jonas shook his head slightly, a gesture that told her there was nothing to apologize for. He guided her to a fallen log near what had once been the mill's main entrance, then began unsaddling his horse. The stallion had earned its rest, and Jonas needed to tend to both their wounds before exhaustion claimed them both. Inside the mill, Jonas had established a small camp hidden from view by the collapsed roof timbers. A ring of stones contained the ashes of previous fires, and his bedroll was spread on a relatively dry patch of floor. His saddlebags held basic supplies, hardtack, jerky, coffee, and a bottle of whiskey that served double duty as antiseptic and pain relief. He lit a small fire using dry wood he'd collected during his stay, keeping the flames low to avoid detection. The flickering light revealed Margaret's face clearly for the first time since their escape. Soot streaked her cheeks, and her hair had come loose from its simple bun, but her green eyes held a strength that the night's horrors hadn't diminished. "You're hurt," she said. Noticing the dark stain spreading across his shirt shoulder, Jonas nodded, then pointed to her own injuries. Her hands were scraped raw from the rough iron chains, and burns marked her wrists where the metal had heated during the fire. Her dress was singed in several places, and a cut on her forehead oozed blood where flying debris had struck her during their escape. Margaret managed a weak smile. "Looks like we both need tending." She moved toward him with the purposeful grace of someone accustomed to healing others. Despite her own injuries and exhaustion, her instincts as a healer overrode everything else. Jonas tried to wave her off, but she fixed him with a look that brooked no argument. "I've been taking care of people longer than I've been running from them," she said firmly. "Let me see that shoulder." With gentle but insistent hands, she helped him remove his coat and shirt. The bullet had torn through the meat of his shoulder without hitting bone or major blood vessels. Painful, but not life-threatening. Margaret examined the wound with practiced eyes, noting the clean entry and exit holes. "You were lucky," she said, though they both knew luck had little to do with it. The bullet went straight through. "We need to clean it and stop the bleeding." Jonas handed her the whiskey bottle, understanding passing between them without words. Margaret soaked a piece of torn fabric from her petticoat in the alcohol, then looked into his eyes. "This is going to hurt." Jonas nodded and braced himself against the stone wall. When the alcohol hit the raw wound, fire exploded through his shoulder and down his arm. His jaw clenched and his breathing grew ragged, but he made no sound. Margaret worked quickly, and efficiently, cleaning both entry and exit wounds before binding them with strips of clean cloth from his saddlebags. When she finished, Jonas reached for her hands, examining the raw patches where the chains had rubbed her skin bloody. He cleaned and bandaged her injuries with the same careful attention she had shown him, his large hands surprisingly gentle as they worked. "Thank you," Margaret said when he finished. "For everything." Jonas met her eyes in the firelight, then slowly reached into his coat pocket. He withdrew a small leather journal and a pencil stub, opening to a blank page. His handwriting was careful and deliberate as he wrote a single question. "Why were you really on trial?" Margaret read the words, then looked up at him with surprise. "You don't believe I'm a witch?" Jonas shook his head firmly, then wrote again. "Saw enough innocent people die. Know the difference." She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeing something in the flames that others couldn't. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There was a girl named Emma Patterson. She came to me beaten and terrified, running from a forced marriage to a brutal man. I helped her escape, gave her money and directions to safety." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. Her father reported her missing rather than admit he'd sold her to pay gambling debts. When they found blood on her torn dress, the Reverend saw an opportunity to rid the town of someone he considered a threat to his influence. Jonas wrote. "The girl? Safe, I hope." "She was heading to relatives in Sacramento last I saw her." Margaret's voice grew bitter. "But the truth didn't matter. Morse needed someone to blame for the girl's disappearance, and I was convenient. A woman living alone, healing with herbs and knowledge instead of prayer and submission. I represented everything he preached against." Jonas nodded understanding, then wrote another question. "Family?" "Dead," Margaret replied simply. "Parents were taken by cholera when I was 17. Never married. No man wanted a wife who knew more about medicine than he did. The townspeople tolerated me because they needed my skills. But tolerance isn't the same as acceptance." She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them for warmth and comfort. "What about you? Where did you learn to fight?" "Like that?" Jonas hesitated, his pencil hovering over the paper. Finally, he wrote, "War. Lost everything, including my voice." "The war took your voice?" Margaret asked gently. Jonas touched his throat, then wrote a longer explanation. "Confederate. Saber. Cut deep. Damaged something inside. Haven't spoken in 7 years until tonight." "But you spoke tonight," Margaret said, wonder in her voice, "when you called for your horse." Jonas looked at the words he'd written, then slowly added, "Some things worth finding your voice for." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes at the simple honesty of his statement. This man, this stranger who had risked everything to save her, had quite literally found his voice again in her defense. She reached out and touched his hand, a gesture of gratitude that needed no words. "What were you doing in Millfield?" she asked, "before all this?" Jonas flipped to another page and wrote more extensively, tracking 3 men. Outlaws who killed my brother and his family. Then following them for 8 months. Trail led through your town. Your brother? Nathan Clay. Had a small ranch outside Denver. Wife, 2 young children. Jonas paused in his writing, his jaw tightening. With old pain. The men I'm hunting burned them out for the land. Killed Nathan when he tried to protect his family. Wife and children died in the fire. Margaret's heart clenched at the stark words. I'm so sorry. Jonas nodded, then wrote, only family I had left. These men think they can take what they want, kill who they please. Someone has to stop them, and you think that someone is you. Jonas met her eyes steadily, then wrote, who else? The simple question carried the weight of a man who had seen too much injustice go unpunished. Margaret recognized the burden he carried, the responsibility of being strong enough to act when others couldn't or wouldn't. She had carried a similar weight. In her own way, using her skills to heal in a world that seemed determined to break people. "The men you're hunting," she said. "Are they still in the area?" Jonas wrote, "Tracks led north from Millfield yesterday. Probably heard the commotion tonight and moved on. But I'll find them. What about the law? Couldn't the sheriff help?" Bitter smile crossed Jonas's face as he wrote, "Law doesn't reach everywhere. Some places, some people, the only justice they understand comes from a gun." Margaret studied his face in the firelight, seeing the lines of weariness and pain that spoke of years spent walking a hard road. "How long have you been doing this? Hunting bad men?" "Since the war ended, nothing else left to do." "That's no way." "To live," Margaret said softly. Jonas wrote, "Not living. Just existing. Until tonight." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Margaret felt her heart skip at the suggestion in his statement, but she forced herself to think practically. "What happens now?" She asked. "They'll never stop hunting me." "Not after what happened tonight." Jonas considered this, then wrote, "Come with me." "What?" "Help me track these men, healing." "I know killing. Together we might do some good." Margaret stared at him in amazement. "You're asking me to become an outlaw? Asking you to help stop the kind of men who burn innocent people?" Jonas wrote steadily. "World needs more people willing to stand between the strong and the weak. I don't know anything about tracking or fighting. I do. You know things I don't. People are more likely to trust a woman, more likely to tell you things they'd never tell a gunfighter." Margaret was quiet for a long time, considering his proposal. Everything she had known, everyone she had cared about in Millfield was lost to her now. She could try to start over somewhere else, build a new life as a healer in a place where no one knew her history. But she had seen tonight what happened when good people stayed silent while evil prospered. "The men you're hunting," she said finally. "Tell me about them." Jonas flipped to a fresh page and began writing. "Leader is Cade Brennan. Cousin to the mayor who had me banned from Millfield years ago. Uses family connections to stay ahead of the law. About 40, red hair, scar on his left cheek from a knife fight. Dangerous but smart. Second man is Miguel Santos. Former soldier. Served with Brennan during the war. Good with a rifle, better with explosives. Missing 2 fingers on his right hand from a bomb that went off too soon. Third is Tommy Vance, young, maybe 22. Fast draw but poor judgment. Follows Brennan like a loyal dog. Has a birthmark on his neck shaped like a crescent moon." Margaret memorized the descriptions, her healer's mind automatically cataloging details that might be useful in identifying the men. "What's their pattern? How do they choose their targets?" Jonas wrote, "Isolated homesteads. Families with something worth taking, but no way to defend it. They scout for weeks, learning routines, waiting for the right moment. Make it look like accidents or Indian raids when they can. How many families?" "At least 12 that I know of, probably more." Margaret felt a cold anger building in her chest. These weren't desperate men stealing to survive. They were predators who killed. For profit and convenience. And the law really can't touch them. Brennan's family has influence in 3 states. Evidence disappears. Witnesses change their stories or disappear themselves. Sheriff Morrison back in Millfield is probably the most honest lawman I've met in years. And you saw how much good that did tonight. Margaret made her decision. "When do we leave?" Jonas looked up from his journal in surprise. "You're sure? Those men killed your family. Tonight, I nearly died healing a girl who needed help. If we don't stop people like that, who will?" Jonas nodded slowly, then wrote, "Won't be easy. They know the country, have places to hide. Could take months to corner them." "I have nowhere else to go," Margaret said simply. "And I suspect you don't either." For the first time since she'd met him, Jonas smiled. It transformed his weathered face, revealing glimpses of the younger man he had been before war and loss. Carved the hardness into his features. He wrote one more line in his journal, then turned it so she could read it. "Partners then, until justice is done." Margaret nodded, sealing their unlikely partnership with a handshake that felt more like a sacred vow. Outside the ruined mill, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards and sending sparks from their small fire spiraling up toward the stars. Tomorrow they would begin hunting the hunters, seeking justice for the dead and protection for the innocent. Tonight, they sat in comfortable silence, two wounded souls who had found purpose in each other's company. The fire burned low as exhaustion finally claimed them both. Jonas took first watch while Margaret slept on his bedroll, her breathing deep and peaceful despite everything she had endured. For the first time in 7 years, he felt something other than empty vengeance driving him forward. He had found his voice again, and perhaps something even more valuable, hope that their fight might actually make a difference in a world that seemed determined to break the good and reward the wicked. Dawn was still hours away, but Jonas Clay was no longer counting the time until he could kill the men who had destroyed his family. Instead, he was planning how he and Margaret Whitmore would build something better from the ashes of their former lives. 3 days of hard writing had brought Jonas and Margaret to the trading post at Devil's Canyon, a ramshackle collection of buildings squatting in the shadow of red sandstone cliffs. The settlement existed to serve travelers crossing the Badlands, a place where questions weren't asked and answers weren't given unless paid for in silver or lead. Margaret pulled her new hat low over her eyes as they approached the main building. Jonas had procured the disguise from a general store in the last town they'd passed through, along with men's clothing that helped hide her feminine figure. To any casual observer, she appeared to be a young ranch hand traveling with an older gunfighter. The transformation had been Margaret's idea. A woman traveling alone with a man would draw unwanted attention and questions, but a pair of drifters looking for work or information would barely merit a second glance in a place like this. Jonas dismounted first, his eyes scanning the handful of horses tied to the hitching posts outside the trading post. His hand moved instinctively to rest on his gun butt as he recognized one of the animals, a distinctive paint horse with a white blaze and black spots. He'd seen that horse before, carrying one of the men he'd been tracking. He helped Margaret down from her own mount, a sturdy mare they'd acquired 2 days earlier from a farmer whose sick cattle she'd successfully treated. The man had been so grateful for saving his herd that he'd practically given them the horse, along with supplies and his blessing. "One of them is here," Jonas wrote quickly in his journal, showing Margaret the page. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. They had discussed this possibility during their journey. The 3 outlaws would need supplies eventually, and Devil's Canyon was one of the few places in this desolate country where a man could buy ammunition, whiskey, and information without revealing his name. Which one? Margaret whispered. Jonas wrote, "Tommy Vance, the young one. Probably inside getting drunk." They had planned for this scenario during their long rides across the desert. Margaret would enter first, playing the part of a drifter looking for work. Her job was to gather information while Jonas positioned himself to prevent Vance's escape if things went wrong. Margaret nodded her understanding and walked toward the trading post's swinging doors. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to move with the casual swagger of a young man who had nothing to hide. The wooden boards creaked under her boots as she stepped onto the porch. Inside, the trading post was exactly what she had expected. Dimly lit, thick with tobacco smoke, and reeking of unwashed bodies and cheap whiskey. A handful of rough men sat at mismatched tables, playing cards or nursing drinks. Behind the bar, a heavy-set woman with graying hair watched the room with the wariness of someone who had seen too much violence to trust anyone completely. Margaret's eyes found Tommy Vance immediately. He sat alone at a corner table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey before him, and a deck of cards spread in a game of solitaire. The crescent-shaped birthmark on his neck was clearly visible above his collar, exactly as Jonas had described. He appeared to be in his early 20s, with sandy hair and the kind of boyish features that would have been handsome if not for the cruel set of his mouth. Margaret approached the bar, keeping Vance in her peripheral vision. "Whiskey," she said in a voice pitched lower than normal. "And information if you're selling it." The bartender, who Margaret assumed was the owner, poured a shot of amber liquid into a grimy glass. "Information costs extra. Depends what your article." "Buying. Looking for work," Margaret said, tossing a silver coin onto the scarred wooden surface. "Heard there might be opportunities for a man with steady hands and a closed mouth." The woman's eyes narrowed as she studied Margaret's face. For a moment, Margaret feared she had been recognized, but then the bartender nodded toward Vance's table. "Young fellow over there was asking similar questions earlier. Said he was expecting his partners to meet him here. Maybe they're looking to add another gun to their crew." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. If Brennan and Santos were coming here, this could be their chance to end the hunt. But it also meant the odds were about to shift dramatically against them. "When are his partners expected?" Margaret asked, taking a careful sip of the harsh whiskey. "Could be today, could be next week. Men like that don't keep regular schedules." The bartender leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Word of advice, boy. That one's got a temper and a quick hand with iron. Killed a man in here 2 nights ago over a card game. Sheriff won't be around to investigate for another week." Margaret nodded her thanks and carried her drink to an empty table where she could watch both Vance and the entrance. She pulled out a worn deck of cards and began dealing herself a hand of poker, playing the part of a bored drifter with time to kill. 20 minutes passed before Vance noticed her. The young outlaw's eyes had been growing progressively more unfocused as he worked his way through the whiskey bottle, but when Margaret dealt a new hand, his attention sharpened. "You play poker for money, boy?" Vance called out, his words slightly slurred. Margaret looked up as if just noticing him. "Depends on the stakes." Vance grinned, showing teeth that needed attention from a dentist. "Come on over. I'm feeling lucky." Tonight, Margaret gathered her cards and moved to Vance's table, her stomach churning with nervousness. Up close, she could see the hardness in his eyes that marked him as a killer despite his youthful appearance. This was a man who had taken lives without hesitation, who had helped murder Jonas's family and countless others. "Name's Jim," Margaret said, extending her hand. "Tommy," Vance replied, his grip lingering longer than necessary. "You look young to be riding alone." "Old enough to take care of myself," Margaret replied carefully. Vance dealt the cards with practiced ease, but Margaret could see the telltale signs of alcohol affecting his coordination. His movements were just slightly off, his reactions a fraction slower than they should have been. If Jonas made his move now, they might be able to take Vance alive and extract information about Brennan and Santos. "So what brings you to this garden spot?" Vance asked as they arranged their cards. "Same as most folks, I reckon. Looking for an opportunity." "What kind of opportunity?" Margaret pretended to study her hand while choosing her words carefully. "The kind that pays well and doesn't ask too many questions about a man's past." Vance's eyes lit up with interest. "You running from something, Jim? Aren't we all?" The young outlaw laughed and raised the bet. "Fair enough. I like a man who keeps his business to himself." They played several hands in relative silence, Margaret deliberately losing small amounts to keep Vance interested and talking. The whiskey continued to flow, and the outlaw's tongue gradually loosened. "You know," Vance said, leaning across the table conspiratorially, "a man with your discretion might be just what my partners and I are looking for. We've got a business proposition that could make us all rich." "What kind of business?" "The kind where we help ourselves to things that other people ain't using properly." Vance's grin turned predatory. Folks out here got more land and cattle than they can protect. We just help redistribute the wealth." Margaret fought to keep her expression neutral as Vance essentially confessed to being a rustler and worse. "Sounds dangerous. Life's dangerous. Difference is, we get paid for our risks. Where are these partners of yours?" Vance's eyes suddenly grew sharper, as if some survival instinct had pierced through the alcohol haze. "Why are you so interested?" "In my partners?" Margaret realized she had pushed too hard too fast. "Just wondering if this opportunity is real, or if you're just drunk and bragging." For a moment, tension crackled between them. Vance's hand moved closer to his gun, and Margaret prepared to dive for cover. Then the outlaw laughed and relaxed. "Fair question. Kate and Miguel should be here tomorrow, maybe the day after. Then we can discuss business properly." Margaret nodded and returned to her cards, but her mind was racing. If Brennan and Santos were coming tomorrow, she and Jonas needed to be ready. They would have one chance to get this right. The game continued. For another hour before Vance finally stumbled to his feet, too drunk to continue playing coherently. "I'm gonna get some sleep," he announced. "Maybe we'll talk more tomorrow, Jim." Margaret watched him weave his way toward the stairs that led to the trading post's upper rooms. Once he disappeared from sight, she finished her drink and made her way outside. Jonas was waiting in the shadows beside the building, positioned where he could watch both the main entrance and the back door. Margaret joined him, and he immediately pulled out his journal. "Well," he wrote, "Brennan and Santos are coming tomorrow or the next day," Margaret whispered. "Vance is drunk and careless. This might be our best chance." Jonas nodded grimly then. Wrote, "Too many innocents inside for a gunfight. Need to draw them out. Vance mentioned they're planning another job. Maybe we can pose as potential victims. Lure them into a trap. Dangerous. If they recognize us... Everything we're doing is dangerous," Margaret pointed out. "But it might be the only way to get close enough." Jonas considered this, then wrote, "What did you learn about their operation?" Margaret shared everything Vance had told her, including his casual admission of robbery and murder. Jonas's jaw tightened as he read her account, but he remained silent. "There's something else," Margaret added. "The bartender said Vance killed a man here 2 nights ago. The sheriff won't be around for another week." Jonas wrote, "No law to interfere. Could work in our favor." They spent the next hour planning their approach. By the time Brennan and Santos arrived, Jonas and Margaret would be ready with a story designed to draw the outlaws into a vulnerable position. It was risky, but it might be their only chance to end the hunt. As they prepared to bed down for the night in a small camp outside town, Margaret found herself thinking about how much her life had changed in just a few days. A week ago, she had been a healer living quietly on the outskirts of a small town. Now she was planning to help capture or kill 3 dangerous outlaws. "Are you having second thoughts?" Jonas wrote when he noticed her expression. Margaret shook her head, just thinking about how quickly everything can change. "Regrets? No," she said firmly. "These men need to be stopped. If we don't do it, who will?" Jonas smiled slightly and wrote, "You sound like a gunfighter. Maybe I am becoming one." That night, as Margaret lay wrapped in her blanket beneath the stars, she thought about the path that had brought her to this place. The accusations of witchcraft seemed like something from another lifetime. Now she was no longer running from those who would harm the innocent. She was hunting them. Tomorrow would bring either justice or death, possibly both. But for the first time since the night Jonas had pulled her from the flames, Margaret felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The hunt was about to reach its climax, and Margaret Whitmore was ready for whatever came next. Jonas maintained watch through the night, his eyes never leaving the trading post where Tommy Vance slept off. His drunk. Somewhere in the darkness beyond Devil's Canyon, Kate Brennan and Miguel Santos were riding toward what they believed would be another profitable venture. Instead, They were riding toward a reckoning that was 7 years in the making. Dawn broke, clear and cold over the red rocks of Devil's Canyon, and with it came the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Jonas counted 2 riders coming from the north, their silhouettes dark against the morning sky. Brennan and Santos had arrived. The final confrontation was about to begin. Cade. Brennan rode into Devil's Canyon like a man who owned the world. His red hair caught the morning sunlight as he surveyed the trading post with calculating eyes, taking note of every horse, every potential threat, every possible escape route. Behind him, Miguel Santos followed with the patient alertness of a predator who had learned that carelessness was often fatal in their line of work. From their concealed position atop the canyon rim, Jonas and Margaret watched the 2 outlaws dismount and secure their horses. Jonas held a spyglass to his eye, studying the men who had haunted his dreams for 8 long months. Brennan was exactly as described, tall, confident, with the bearing of a natural leader. The scar on his left cheek was clearly visible even at this distance, a white line that bisected his face from ear to jaw. Santos presented a different kind of danger. Where Brennan commanded through charisma and force of personality, the Mexican was a coiled spring of barely contained violence. His movements were economical and precise, and Jonas noticed how his dark eyes constantly swept their surroundings. This was a man who had survived too many ambushes to ever be completely at ease. "They look dangerous," Margaret whispered, lowering her own field glasses. Jonas nodded grimly and wrote in his journal, "Brennan thinks he's invincible. Santos knows better. He's the one to watch." Their plan was already in motion. An hour earlier, Margaret had returned to the trading post, spinning a tale about representing a wealthy widow who needed protection for a valuable shipment crossing hostile territory. The story was designed to appeal to Brennan's greed while providing a pretext for drawing the outlaws away from the populated area. According to Margaret's fictional account, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell was transporting her late husband's gold coins and jewelry from California to family in St. Louis. The widow was traveling with only a small escort and would be passing through Dead Man's Gulch, a narrow canyon 20 miles south where an ambush would be easy to arrange and difficult to escape. The beauty of the deception lay in its believability. Such shipments did cross this territory regularly, and the outlaws had built their reputation by preying on exactly this type of target. Brennan would see it as an opportunity too good to pass up. Jonas watched through the spyglass as Brennan and Santos entered the trading post. He could imagine the conversation taking place inside, Vance eagerly sharing the intelligence about the gold shipment while Brennan evaluated the potential risks and rewards. Santos would be more cautious, asking pointed questions about the source of the information and the reliability of their young contact. Margaret would have to be convincing. Any sign of deception could turn their trap into their own death sentence. 20 minutes passed before Margaret emerged from the building. She walked casually to her horse, mounted, and rode slowly out of town as if departing for good. But once she was out of sight of the trading post, she would circle back to meet Jonas at the predetermined rendezvous point. Jonas waited another hour before making his own move. He needed to get closer to confirm that the outlaws were taking the bait. Moving carefully down the canyon wall, he positioned himself where he could observe the trading post without being seen. The 3 outlaws emerged together shortly after noon, their body language suggesting heated discussion. Brennan gestured emphatically while Santos shook his head, clearly voicing objections to whatever plan was being proposed. Vance stood between them, looking like a younger brother caught between arguing parents. Finally, Brennan's will prevailed. The 3 men saddled their horses and began loading supplies for what appeared to be an extended journey. Jonas smiled grimly as he watched them check their weapons and ammunition. They were definitely planning to intercept the fictional Mrs. Hartwell and her equally fictional gold shipment. The trap was set. Jonas made his way back to the rendezvous point, a box canyon 5 miles from Devil's Canyon, where Margaret waited with their horses and supplies. She had changed back into her women's clothing, having no further need for the masculine disguise. Her face was pale with nervous tension, but her eyes held steady determination. "They took the bait?" she asked as Jonas approached. He nodded and wrote, "All 3. Brennan convinced the others. They'll ride for Dead Man's Gulch within the hour. And if they get there first? If they realize we're not coming? They won't wait long. Brennan's greedy but not stupid. He'll scout the area, realize it's a trap, and try to backtrack." Margaret studied the rough map Jonas had drawn of the terrain between Devil's Canyon and Dead Man's Gulch. "So we intercept them on the return journey. At Widow's Creek. Only water for 30 miles in any direction. They'll have to stop there." The location Jonas had chosen was tactically perfect. A narrow valley with steep sides and limited escape routes. A single gunman positioned correctly could control the entire area. But more importantly, it was where Nathan Clay and his family were buried. Where Jonas's quest for justice had begun. It seemed fitting that it should end there as well. They rode hard for Widow's Creek, taking a direct route while the outlaws would be forced to follow the longer trail through Dead Man's Gulch. Jonas pushed their horses mercilessly, knowing they needed time to prepare their positions before Brennan's gang arrived. The creek meandered through a valley, perhaps 200 yards wide, flanked by rocky hills that provided excellent cover for riflemen. A few scraggly cottonwoods marked the water's location, their bare branches offering little concealment for anyone caught in the open. Jonas studied the terrain with a soldier's eye, planning fields of fire and escape routes with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 4 years of war and 8 years of hunting dangerous men. The outlaws would approach from the south, following the natural trail that led down from the highlands. When they stopped to water their horses, they would be vulnerable. "Where do you want me?" Margaret asked. Jonas pointed to a cluster of boulders. "On the eastern slope, high ground. Good view of the whole valley. If things go wrong, you can get away." "I'm not running," Margaret said firmly. "We're partners, remember?" Jonas looked at her for a long moment, seeing the steel beneath her gentle exterior. The woman who had once healed children's fevers was now prepared to stand and fight against killers. War and injustice had a way of transforming people, and Margaret Whitmore was discovering reserves of strength she had never known she possessed. "Can you shoot?" Jonas wrote. "My father taught me to hunt. I'm better with a rifle than a pistol." Jonas nodded and handed her his Winchester repeater, along with a box of cartridges. For himself, he kept his pair of Colt revolvers and a shorter carbine. That would be more maneuverable in close combat. They spent the remaining daylight hours preparing their positions and reviewing their plan. Jonas would take the western slope, positioned to cut off any retreat toward Devil's Canyon. Margaret would provide covering fire from the east while watching for anyone trying to circle around behind them. The key was patience. They would let the outlaws enter the valley, dismount, and relax their guard before making their presence known. Jonas wanted them captured alive if possible. Dead men couldn't provide information about other crimes or help identify additional victims who deserved justice. But if it came to killing, he was prepared for that as well. As sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and crimson, Jonas made his way to Nathan's grave. The simple wooden cross was weathered now, the letters of his brother's name barely visible after months of wind and rain. Beside it, smaller markers showed where Nathan's wife Anna and their children Samuel and Rebecca lay beneath the prairie soil. Jonas knelt beside the graves, finally allowing himself to feel the full weight of his loss. For 8 months he had focused solely on the hunt, letting anger and purpose drive him forward. But now, with the end finally in sight, grief threatened to overwhelm him. He pulled out his journal and wrote a letter he would never send. "Nathan, I found them. The men who killed you and your family. Tomorrow there will be justice, I know it won't bring you back, but maybe it will stop them from hurting anyone else. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry I wasn't here to protect you. But I kept my promise. I never stopped hunting them." Jonas tore the page from his journal and buried it beside Nathan's grave, a final message from brother to brother. Then he rose and walked back toward his fighting position, his heart heavy but his purpose clear. Margaret was already in position among the rocks, testing the rifle's action and checking her ammunition. She looked up as Jonas approached, and he saw his own determination reflected in her eyes. "Are you ready for this?" she asked quietly. Jonas nodded and wrote one final message in his journal, showing it to her in the fading light. "Justice is coming." They settled in to wait as darkness fell over Widow's Creek. Somewhere in the night, 3 killers were riding toward a reckoning they had never imagined. The hunt that had consumed Jonas Clay's life for 8 months was finally approaching its end. But justice, they would soon discover, sometimes wore an unexpected face. The moon was rising full and bright when they heard the first sound of approaching horses. Jonas felt his pulse quicken as he checked his weapons one final time. Everything they had planned, everything they had sacrificed, came down to the next few hours. Margaret caught his eye across the valley and nodded. She was ready. The outlaws were coming, and the trap was about to close. Through his field glasses, Jonas could make out 3 riders picking their way carefully down the trail toward the creek. Even in the moonlight, he recognized Brennan's distinctive silhouette in the way. Santos sat his saddle with predatory alertness. They had followed the false trail to Dead Man's Gulch as predicted, found no wealthy widow with a gold shipment, and were now returning toward Devil's Canyon along the only route that offered water for their horses. Exactly as Jonas had anticipated, the outlaws rode into the valley in single file, with Santos taking point and Brennan bringing up the rear. Vance rode between them, no longer the carefree young man who had gotten drunk and boasted to a stranger. In a trading post, the failed ambush had clearly sobered him, and now he scanned the surrounding hills with nervous energy. They reached the creek without incident and dismounted to water their horses. Jonas watched as Santos immediately took up a defensive position while Brennan and Vance tended to the animals. The Mexican's caution had probably saved their lives on numerous occasions, but tonight it would not be enough. Jonas waited until all 3 men had relaxed slightly, until their horses were drinking and their attention was focused on the immediate task of making camp. Then he stood up on the rocky slope, his silhouette clearly visible in the moonlight. "Cade Brennan," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the narrow valley. It was the first time he had spoken loudly in 7 years, and the sound felt strange in his throat. The 3 outlaws spun toward his voice, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. But Jonas was already talking, his words flowing with the certainty of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times. "My name is Jonas Clay. You killed my brother Nathan, his wife Anna, and their children. You burned their home and stole their land. Tonight, you answer for those crimes." Brennan stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun butt, but not yet drawing. "Clay, I remember you now. The mute who rode with that cavalry unit during the war. Heard you lost your voice when that Confederate officer carved up your throat." "I found it again," Jonas replied, his voice steady despite the emotions churning in his chest. "Found it just in time to see justice done." Santos had drawn his rifle and was scanning the hills for additional threats. "There's someone else up there," he called to Brennan. "East slope behind those rocks." "That's right," Jonas said. "You're surrounded. Drop your weapons and surrender, and you'll live to see the trial." Brennan laughed, a sound devoid of any real humor. "You always were a dreamer, Clay. 3 against 2, and we're not exactly choir boys. What makes you think we're just going to give up?" "Because the alternative is dying here beside this creek, and I don't think any of you are quite ready for that." The standoff stretched taut as a wire, each side evaluating options and calculating odds. Then Vance made the decision for all of them. The young outlaw's nerve broke first. With a strangled cry, he drew his pistol and fired wildly toward Jonas's position. The shot went wide, sparking off stone, but it shattered the fragile peace of the negotiations. Everything happened at once. Santos dove for cover behind his horse while bringing his rifle to bear on Margaret's position. Brennan drew with the fluid motion of a professional gunfighter, his first shot coming within inches of Jonas's head, but Jonas was already moving, rolling behind a boulder as bullets chipped stone around him. From across the valley, Margaret's Winchester cracked once, twice, sending Santos scrambling for better cover as his horse reared and bolted. The battle for Widow's Creek had begun, and before it was over, the dead would have their justice at last. The gunfight at Widow's Creek exploded into chaos as three desperate outlaws fought for their lives against two determined hunters seeking justice. Muzzle flashes lit the night like deadly fireflies, and the crack of rifles echoed off the canyon walls in a thunderous symphony of violence. Jonas rolled behind a larger boulder as Brennan's second shot sparked off the rock where his head had been moments before. The outlaw leader was deadly accurate, even firing in poor light, and Jonas knew he was facing a gunfighter with skills to match his own. But accuracy alone wouldn't save Brennan tonight. Jonas had the advantage of knowing this terrain intimately, having spent days studying every rock and shadow. From her position across the valley, Margaret's Winchester spoke again, the bullet whining past Santos's ear and forcing him to dive deeper into the scant cover provided by a fallen cottonwood. The Mexican cursed it fluently in Spanish as he tried to line up a shot on the woman who had appeared from nowhere to complicate their escape. Where the hell did Clay find himself a partner? Vance shouted, his voice cracking with fear as he fumbled to reload his revolver with shaking hands. "Shut up and shoot." Brennan barked back, squeezing off another round at Jonas's position. The outlaw leader's mind was racing, trying to assess their tactical situation. They were caught in a crossfire with limited cover and no easy escape route. His horse had bolted during the first exchange, along with Santos's mount, leaving them trapped on foot in hostile territory. Jonas rose slightly from behind his boulder, using the moonlight to gauge distances and angles. He had spent years perfecting his marksmanship, both during the war and in the violent aftermath that followed. Every shot had to count when you were outnumbered and outgunned. His first return shot took Vance in the shoulder, spinning the young outlaw around and sending his pistol flying into the creek with a splash. Vance screamed and clutched his wounded arm, blood seeping between his fingers as he stumbled toward better cover. "Tommy's hit," Santos called out, his voice tight with concern despite the desperate circumstances. "He's still breathing," Brennan replied coldly. "That's more than we'll be if we don't get out of this trap." The outlaw leader was already formulating a plan. If they could suppress the woman's fire long enough, Santos might be able to work his way up the eastern slope and flank her position. Once they eliminated one shooter, the odds would shift back in their favor. But Jonas had anticipated this strategy. As Santos began his move, sliding from shadow to shadow along the creek bank, Jonas shifted his own position. He moved with the silent grace of a hunter who had spent months tracking these men, knowing that a single misstep could mean death. Margaret saw Santos's flanking maneuver developing and adjusted her aim accordingly. Her father had indeed taught her to hunt, but shooting at deer was vastly different from shooting at men who were shooting back. Still, she forced herself to remain calm, controlling her breathing and leading her targets just as she had learned with quail and rabbit. Her next shot caught Santos in the leg, sending him tumbling behind a cluster of rocks 20 yards from her position. The Mexican's rifle skittered away across the stone, leaving him armed with only his sidearm. But wounded and cornered, he was more dangerous than ever. "Miguel's down," Vance cried out, his voice high with panic. "Not down," Santos growled through gritted teeth. "Just slowed up a bit." Brennan realized their situation was deteriorating rapidly. In his years of outlawry, he had always held the advantage, striking from ambush, overwhelming lone travelers or small homesteads with superior numbers and firepower. This was the first time he had been the one caught in a trap, and the experience was teaching him uncomfortable lessons about vulnerability. "Clay," he called out across the valley, "this doesn't have to end with all of us dead. We can make a deal." Jonas's reply came from a different position, 30 yards from where he had been moments before. "The only deal is surrender. Drop your weapons and come out with your hands visible." "And then what? A trial? A rope?" Brennan laughed bitterly. "We both know how this ends. At least let us die fighting like men." "You didn't give my brother that choice," Jonas replied, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Nathan was unarmed when you shot him. Anna and the children were helpless when you burned them alive." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and for a moment the shooting stopped as all present contemplated the weight of past sins. Even Vance, bleeding and terrified, seemed to understand that this was more than a simple gunfight. It was a reckoning years in the making. Santos used the lull to bind his wounded leg, with strips torn from his shirt. The bullet had missed the bone but torn through muscle and sinew, leaving him barely able to walk. He knew his chances of surviving the night were diminishing with each passing minute. "Cade," he called softly to his leader, "maybe we should consider." "His offer." "Never," Brennan snarled. "I'd rather die here than dance at the end of a rope." "Then you'll get your wish," Jonas replied. The gunfight resumed with renewed intensity. Jonas had worked his way closer to the outlaw's position, using the terrain to his advantage. He moved like a ghost through the moonlight, appearing long enough to fire a shot before melting back into the shadows. His tactics were wearing down the outlaw's nerves and ammunition. Brennan had already burned through most of his cartridges, and Santos was limited to the rounds in his pistol cylinder. Only Vance still had significant ammunition, but his wounded shoulder made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Margaret maintained steady pressure from her elevated position, forcing the outlaws to keep their heads down while Jonas maneuvered for a decisive shot. She had discovered a talent for combat that surprised her. The same steady hands that had once mixed healing potions now held a rifle with deadly accuracy. "I count maybe a dozen shots between them," she called across to Jonas during a brief lull in the firing. Jonas nodded acknowledgement and made his decision. It was time to end this. He began working his way around to the outlaw's flank, using a dry wash that led almost to their position. The approach was dangerous. If they spotted him coming, he would be caught in the open with nowhere to run. But the alternative was a prolonged siege. That might allow one or more of the killers to escape in the darkness. Santos saw him coming first. The wounded Mexican raised his pistol and fired, but pain and blood loss affected his aim. The bullet went wide, alerting Brennan to Jonas's flanking maneuver. "He's moving on our left," Santos shouted. Brennan spun toward the new threat, his revolver tracking toward Jonas's approaching figure. But he was a fraction of a second too slow. Jonas's Colt spoke first, the heavy bullet taking Brennan center mass and spinning him around. Like a child's top, the outlaw leader staggered but remained upright, his own gun wavering in his grasp. Blood darkened his shirt front, but he was still dangerous. Wounded predators often fought hardest when cornered. "You should have minded your own business, Clay," Brennan gasped, raising his weapon for one final shot. Jonas's second bullet took him between the eyes, ending Cade Brennan's reign of terror forever. The outlaw leader crumpled to the rocky ground, his unfired pistol clattering away into the darkness. Santos stared at his fallen leader for a moment, then looked up at Jonas with something approaching respect in his dark eyes. "He was a hard man, but he was my friend." "He was a killer," Jonas replied simply. "So are we all, in our way." Santos slowly holstered his pistol. "I surrender." Vance was sobbing now, clutching his wounded shoulder and rocking back and forth like a child. "I didn't want to kill anybody," he wailed. "Cade made me do it. He said it was just business." Jonas kept his gun trained on Santos while Margaret climbed down from her position to help secure the prisoners. The Mexican made no attempt to resist as she bound his wounded leg with clean bandages torn from her own clothing. Old habits died hard, and she couldn't watch a man bleed without trying to help. "You fight well for a woman," Santos observed as she worked on his wound. "Where did Clay find you?" "He didn't find me," Margaret replied. "I found him, or maybe we found each other." Santos nodded as if this made perfect sense. Sometimes that's how it works. Two people meant to ride together. With their prisoners secured and Brennan's body wrapped in a blanket, Jonas and Margaret made camp in the valley to wait for dawn. They would need horses to transport their prisoners to the nearest town with a proper jail, and Santos's leg wound needed medical attention beyond what Margaret could provide in the field. As they sat by their small fire, watching over their captives, Margaret found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this place. 2 weeks ago, she had been an accused witch facing death at the stake. Tonight, she was a partner in bringing justice to men who had terrorized the frontier for years. "Do you think this makes us even?" she asked Jonas quietly. "For all the death and suffering?" Jonas considered the question for a long moment before responding. "Justice isn't about being even. It's about stopping the cycle. These men won't hurt anyone else. And the others like them. There will always be others. But maybe we prevented a few more families from going through what Nathan's did." Santos spoke up from where he lay bound near the fire. "You know there's rewards posted for us in 3 states. Substantial rewards." Jonas nodded. He had seen the wanted posters during his long hunt. "What will you do with the money?" Santos asked. Jonas looked at Margaret, then back at the wounded outlaw. "Haven't thought about it." "There are orphanages," Margaret suggested. "Children whose parents were killed by men like these. The money could help them." It was a fitting use for blood money, turning the bounty on killers into hope for their victims' children. Jonas wrote in his journal and showed her the page. Nathan would like that. As the night wore on, they took turns standing watch while their prisoners slept fitfully by the dying fire. Vance moaned in his sleep, whether from his wound or guilty dreams, no one could say. Santos remained alert despite his injury, the habits of a lifetime keeping him wary, even in captivity. Just before dawn, Margaret found herself alone with Jonas. As he took the final watch, the eastern sky was beginning to show the first pale hints of sunrise, and she knew their long night of violence was finally ending. "What happens now?" she asked. "After we turn them in?" Jonas wrote, "What do you want to happen? I don't know. A week ago I knew exactly what my life was. Now everything is different. Asterisk, different bad or different good." Margaret smiled despite her exhaustion. "Different real. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm doing something that matters." Jonas nodded understanding. "The hunt changes you. Hard to go back to ordinary life after. Is that what we're doing? Starting a new hunt? If you want. Plenty of bad men out there who need stopping." Margaret looked out over the valley where they had fought and bled and brought justice to killers. In the growing light, she could see the simple wooden crosses that marked Jonas's family graves, silent witnesses to the completion of his long quest for vengeance. "Partners then," she said, echoing the words they had spoken in the abandoned mill that now seemed like a lifetime ago. Jonas smiled and wrote one final entry in his journal. "Partners, until justice is done." The sun rose fully over Widow's Creek, painting the rocks and sparse vegetation in shades of gold and crimson. In the distance, dust clouds marked the approach of riders, probably Sheriff Morrison and a posse from Millfield. Drawn by reports of gunfire in the night, Jonas and Margaret stood together as the lawmen approached, ready to turn over their prisoners and collect the rewards that would fund their next mission. Behind them, Cade Brennan lay wrapped in his blanket shroud. His reign of terror ended forever. Santos and Vance waited in their bonds, facing trial and almost certain execution. For their crimes, justice had been served, but more importantly, the cycle of violence had been broken. Nathan Clay and his family could finally rest in peace, knowing their deaths had been avenged and their killers would harm no one else. As Sheriff Morrison and his men rode into the valley, Jonas felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had carried for 8 long months. The hunt that had consumed his life was finally over. But as he looked at Margaret standing beside him, her rifle held with casual competence and determination burning bright in her green eyes, he realized that ending one hunt simply meant beginning another. There were more killers out there. More innocents who needed protection, more families who deserved justice. And now he wouldn't have to face them alone. The partnership forged in fire at a witch's burning had been tempered in gunfire at a killer's reckoning. Whatever came next, Jonas Clay and Margaret Whitmore would face it together. The morning sun climbed higher over Widow's Creek, burning away the shadows and illuminating a new day. A day where justice had triumphed over vengeance, where partnership had proven stronger than isolation, and where 2 damaged souls had found healing in their shared purpose. The hunt was ended, but their real journey was just beginning. 6 months had passed since the gunfight at Widow's Creek, and the legend of the silent gun and the witch's daughter had spread across 3 territories, like wildfire through dry grass. Stories grew in the telling, as they always did on the frontier, but the core truth remained unchanged. Somewhere in the vast expanse of the American West, 2 unlikely partners rode in pursuit of those who preyed upon the innocent. Margaret Whitmore sat astride her chestnut mare on a ridge overlooking the bustling mining town of Silver Falls, Colorado. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley below, where smoke rose from dozens of chimneys and the distant sound of pickaxes rang against stone. It was a place much like any other boom town that had sprouted from the earth, wherever men found gold or silver. But Margaret had learned to look beyond the surface prosperity, to see the rot that often festered beneath. Beside her, Jonas Clay studied the town through his spyglass, his weathered face impassive as always. The months of partnership had changed them both. Margaret's hands, once soft from a healer's work, now bore calluses from handling reins and rifles. Her green eyes held a hardness that came from seeing too much of humanity's darker nature. But they had not lost their compassion. Jonas had changed as well, though more subtly. The grim silence that had defined him for years had softened into something more comfortable, less like armor and more like the natural quiet of a man who chose his words carefully. He spoke more often now, though never wastefully, and Margaret had become fluent in reading the subtle expressions that crossed his face. 3 saloons, 2 brothels, and a gambling hall that never closes, Margaret observed, lowering her own field glasses. And according to our informant, all of them are controlled by the same man, Jonas nodded grimly. Lucas Garrett owns half the businesses in town and most of the mining claims that matter. They had been tracking Garrett for 2 weeks, following a trail of missing prospectors and suspicious accidents that all seemed to benefit his expanding empire. The man was clever, never directly ordering violence, but creating circumstances where it became inevitable. Miners who refused to sell their claims found themselves facing trumped-up charges or mysterious accidents. Those who persisted in their resistance simply disappeared. The Hendricks family arrived in town yesterday, Margaret continued, consulting the notes in her leather journal. 3 brothers and their wives, planning to work the claim their father left them. According to the telegram we intercepted, Garrett wants that land for the railroad spur he's planning. Jonas's jaw tightened. The Hendricks family had no idea they were walking into a trap, believing they were simply claiming their inheritance and starting new lives. By the time they realized the danger, it might be too late. "We need to get down there," Margaret said. But Jonas held up a hand. "Wait, he said quietly, pointing toward a dust cloud rising from the eastern road. Company coming. Through their spyglasses, they watched a group of riders approaching the town. 6 men, heavily armed and riding with the casual arrogance of those who believe themselves untouchable. Margaret recognized the type immediately: hired guns, the kind of men who would do anything for money and ask no questions about the morality of their work. Garrett's enforcement, Jonas observed. Probably coming to give the Hendricks brothers their first warning. Margaret felt the familiar cold anger building in her chest. 6 months of hunting predators had taught her that men like Garrett were often more dangerous than simple killers like Brennan's gang. They hid behind respectability and legal technicalities while orchestrating violence from the shadows. "We can't take on 6 gunmen in the middle of town," she said practically. "Too many innocent people could get hurt." Jonas was already thinking ahead, formulating a plan with the tactical mind that had served them well in previous encounters. "We don't fight them in town. We make them come to us." Over the past months, Jonas and Margaret had developed their own methods for dealing with organized criminals. Where the law was corrupt or simply absent, they provided an alternative form of justice. They had broken up extortion rackets, stopped claim jumpers, and eliminated more than one gang of murderous outlaws. Their reputation had grown with each success. Some called them vigilantes, others saw them as heroes, but everyone agreed they were effective. Wanted posters bore their descriptions in half a dozen towns, while rewards for their capture or cooperation were offered in others. The ambiguity suited them perfectly. It meant they could never be certain who to trust, which kept them sharp and alive. "The old mine shaft 3 miles north of town," Jonas continued, outlining his strategy. "The one that was played out last year. Good defensible position, multiple escape routes." Margaret nodded, understanding immediately. "And how do we get Garrett's men to follow us there?" "By giving them no choice. We take something they can't afford to lose." "What did you have in mind?" Jonas smiled, the expression transforming his face into something almost boyish. "Lucas Garrett's ledger. The one he keeps in his private safe, documenting all his illegal activities." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly do you know about this ledger?" "Because men like Garrett always keep records. They can't resist documenting their own cleverness, even when it could hang them." They spent the rest of the morning observing the town, learning routines and identifying key players in Garrett's organization. The mining baron himself was easy to spot, a tall, well-dressed man in his 50s who carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. He moved through the town like a feudal lord surveying his domain, acknowledging the respectful nods of those who depended on his goodwill for their livelihoods. His office occupied the 2nd floor of the largest building on Main Street, with windows that offered a commanding view of the entire town. Margaret could see the glint of a large safe through one of those windows, positioned where Garrett could keep an eye on his most valuable possessions. "Guard rotation changes every 4 hours, Jonas noted, watching the men posted around Garrett's building. 2 men in the front, 1 in the back, and at least 3 inside at all times. "What about at night?" "Same pattern, but they get careless. Too much drinking, too much confidence." Margaret studied the building's architecture, noting the external staircase that led to a 2nd-floor balcony. "I could get in through that window while you create a distraction." "Too dangerous. If something goes wrong, you'd be trapped." "Then what do you suggest?" Jonas was quiet for several minutes, his mind working through possibilities and contingencies. Finally, he spoke. "We don't break in, we get invited in." That evening, Margaret descended into Silver Falls dressed in her finest clothing, a blue silk dress she had acquired in their last successful venture, complete with matching bonnet and gloves. To any observer, she appeared to be a well-to-do lady traveler, perhaps the wife of a successful businessman or the daughter of a wealthy family. She entered, Garrett's gambling hall with the confidence of someone accustomed to such establishments, drawing appreciative glances from the men crowded around the card tables and roulette wheels. Within minutes, word of the beautiful stranger had reached Garrett himself, who made his way through the crowd with the predatory smile of a man who saw opportunity in every situation. "Good evening, miss," Garrett said, approaching Margaret's table with practiced charm. "I don't believe we've been introduced. Lucas Garrett, at your service." Margaret looked up from her cards with the perfect mixture of shyness and intrigue. "Elizabeth Crawford," she replied, using one of several false identities she and Jonas had established. "I'm traveling through your lovely town on business." "Business? How fascinating. What sort of business brings a lady such as yourself to our humble community?" "Mining investments, actually. My late husband left me with substantial holdings, and I'm looking for new opportunities." Margaret's voice carried just the right note of vulnerable wealth that men like. Garrett found irresistible. Garrett's eyes lit up with avarice barely concealed beneath a veneer of concern. "How tragic that you should be burdened with such responsibilities. Perhaps I could be of assistance? I have extensive knowledge of the mining opportunities in this region." "How kind of you, Mr. Garrett. I was hoping to find someone knowledgeable to advise me." Within an hour, Garrett had invited Margaret to his private office to discuss potential investments. She expressed interest in several of his properties, asking detailed questions about their profitability and future prospects. All the while, she memorized the layout of the office and the location of the safe. "I have all the documentation right here," Garrett said, moving toward the large iron safe that dominated one corner of the room. Surveys, production reports, legal filings, everything a prudent investor would want to examine. As he worked the combination, Margaret noted each number carefully. Garrett was too confident in his own security to worry about a well-dressed lady observing his movements. When he opened the heavy door, she caught a glimpse of the contents: stacks of cash, legal documents, and a thick leather-bound ledger that undoubtedly contained the records Jonas had predicted. "These figures are quite impressive," Margaret said, studying the papers Garrett spread before her. "But I would want to examine your complete records before making any substantial investment." "Of course, my dear lady. I have nothing to hide." That was exactly what Margaret had hoped to hear. While Margaret played her role as the wealthy widow, Jonas positioned himself in the alley behind Garrett's building. He had identified the night guard's routine and knew the man would make his rounds every hour, checking the rear entrance and the stairway to the upper floors. At precisely midnight, as Margaret excused herself from Garrett's office with promises to return the following day, Jonas made his move. The guard was predictably drunk and easily overpowered, bound and gagged without raising an alarm. Jonas then slipped into the building through the rear entrance, moving silently through corridors he had mapped during his earlier reconnaissance. Margaret met him in Garrett's office, which she had left unlocked during her departure. Working together, they opened the safe using the combination she had memorized and quickly located the incriminating ledger. Its pages contained exactly what Jonas had expected: detailed records of bribes, extortion, and murder, all carefully documented in Garrett's own handwriting. "This is enough to hang him 10 times over," Margaret whispered as she photographed key pages with the small camera they carried for such purposes. "If we can get it to an honest judge," Jonas replied. "But first, we need to deal with his hired guns." They replaced the ledger in the safe, but not before Jonas added a small surprise: a note announcing that copies of the incriminating records were now in the hands of federal marshals and newspaper editors in 3 different cities. Whether this was true or not mattered less than Garrett's belief that his empire was crumbling. By dawn, Lucas Garrett had discovered both the break-in and the message. His rage was volcanic, but his fear was even stronger. Everything he had built over 2 decades was in jeopardy, and he knew exactly who was responsible. "Find them," he screamed at his assembled gunmen. I don't care what it takes or how many men you need to hire. Bring me their heads." The manhunt that followed was exactly what Jonas and Margaret had anticipated. Garrett's entire organization mobilized to track down the two people who threatened their existence. But in their fury and desperation, they made the crucial mistake of abandoning the town to pursue their quarry into the wilderness. The abandoned mine shaft where Jonas and Margaret waited was perfectly suited for their purposes. The narrow entrance could be defended by two people against a much larger force, while multiple escape tunnels provided options if retreat became necessary. They had cached supplies and ammunition in advance, turning the played-out mine into a fortress. The confrontation began at noon when Garrett's men tracked them to the mine entrance. 12 gunmen, led by a scarred veteran named Cole Briggs, who had made his reputation as an enforcer for cattle barons and mining companies. "Clay!" "Which?" Briggs called out from behind the rocks that provided cover at the base of the slope. "Garrett wants his property back. Come out now and he might let you live." Jonas's reply came in the form of a rifle shot that sent chips of stone flying near Briggs's head. The message was clear enough. There would be no surrender, no negotiation. The siege lasted 3 hours. Garrett's men tried rushing the mine entrance, flanking maneuvers, and even an attempt to dynamite the shaft. But Jonas and Margaret had chosen their ground well, and their superior positioning negated the attackers' numerical advantage. One by one, the hired guns fell to precise rifle fire. Margaret had become an accomplished marksman during their months together, and her shots were devastating at the ranges involved. Jonas moved through the mine tunnels like a ghost, appearing at different firing positions to confuse and demoralize their enemies. By mid-afternoon, only 4 of Garrett's men remained alive, and 2 of those were wounded. Cole Briggs called for a parley, his voice hoarse from shouting orders and breathing gun smoke. "This is madness." He called up toward the mine. "Garrett ain't paying us enough to die for his ledger." "Then right away," Jonas replied. "We have no quarrel with hired men who know when they're beaten." It was an offer Briggs couldn't refuse. Within an hour, the surviving gunmen had mounted their horses and ridden away, leaving their dead behind. Garrett's private army had been broken, his reputation for invincibility shattered, but Lucas Garrett himself was far from finished. That evening, as Jonas and Margaret prepared to leave their mountain stronghold, they received an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Daniel Morrison rode into their camp alone, his badge glinting in the firelight. "Jonas, Margaret," Morrison nodded to each of them in turn. "Heard you two had been busy up here." "Sheriff," Jonas replied cautiously. Morrison was one of the few lawmen they trusted, but his presence was still a complication. "Got a telegram this morning," Morrison continued, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. "Seems someone sent copies of Lucas Garrett's business records to the territorial governor. Very interesting reading, according to the federal marshals who are riding this way." Margaret and Jonas exchanged glances. Their plan was working even better than they had hoped. "Course, there's also warrants out for both of you in connection with the disturbance at his office and the deaths of his men," Morrison added. "Technically, I should arrest you right now." "Technically," Jonas agreed. Morrison smiled and tucked the telegram back into his pocket. "Good thing I didn't see you two tonight. Just an old mine shaft and some dead outlaws who apparently killed each other in a dispute over stolen property. What about Garrett? Well, that's interesting. Seems he's disappeared. Cleaned out his safe and lit out for parts unknown. Probably Mexico if he's smart. Left the Hendricks family and about a dozen other folks free to work their claims in peace." It was as close to a complete victory as they could have hoped for. Garrett was ruined and in flight, his organization destroyed, and his victims were safe. Justice had been served without the need for corrupt courts or bought judges. "What's next for you two?" Morrison asked as he prepared to leave. Jonas looked at Margaret, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. There would always be more. Predators, more innocents who needed protection, more injustices that the law couldn't or wouldn't address. "Wherever we're needed," Margaret replied. Morrison nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Well, try to stay out of my territory for a while. The paperwork on this mess is going to take me months to sort out." After the sheriff departed, Jonas and Margaret sat by their fire planning their next move. They had received word of troubles. In New Mexico territory, a range war brewing between small ranchers and a powerful cattle baron with political connections. It sounded like the kind of situation that required their particular skills. "Are you ever going to miss it?" Margaret asked as they prepared to break camp. "The quiet life, I mean. Healing people instead of hunting them." Jonas considered the question seriously. "I still heal people, in a way. Just differently than before, by stopping the ones who would hurt them." "Yes," Margaret nodded, understanding completely. She had found her own form of healing in their partnership, not just of individuals, but of communities terrorized by those who believed might be made right. As they rode away from Silver Falls under a canopy of stars, Margaret thought about the strange journey that had brought her to this point. She had begun as an accused witch facing death at the stake, been saved by a mute gunslinger who had found his voice again in her defense, and transformed herself into something she had never imagined possible. They were no longer the desperate fugitives who had fled Millfield 6 months earlier. They had become something more powerful, a force for justice in a land where justice was often in short supply. The Silent Gun and the Witch's Daughter, bringing hope to the hopeless and fear to those who preyed upon the innocent. Behind them, the lights of Silver Falls faded into the distance, but ahead lay the vast expanse of the frontier and all the adventures it held. They rode toward an uncertain future, but they rode together, and that made all the difference. The legend would continue to grow, passed from campfire to campfire, from saloon to church social, from one end of the frontier to the other. Some details would be embellished, others forgotten, but the essential truth would remain. Somewhere in the American West, two unlikely partners continued their endless hunt for justice. And they would keep riding until justice was done, or until the frontier itself was tamed and civilized beyond the need for people like them. Until that day came, Jonas Clay and Margaret Whitmore would be there, guardians of the innocent and the nightmare of those who would prey upon them. The story of the Silent Gun and the Witch's Daughter had only just begun, and the frontier would never be quite the same. 3 years passed like pages torn from a calendar by prairie winds. Jonas Clay and Margaret Whitmore had become more than legends. They were hope incarnate for those who had nowhere else to turn. Their names were whispered in desperate prayers and shouted in defiant toasts from Montana to the Mexican border. In those 3 years, they had dismantled corruption rings in 7 territories, stopped 4 range wars before they could claim innocent lives, and brought justice to more than 30 criminals who thought themselves above the law. Banks robbed, families murdered, women and children sold into slavery. Every crime that shocked the frontier eventually found its way to their attention. But success came with a price that grew heavier with each passing season. Margaret now carried 3 bullet scars on her body, souvenirs from gunfights where split-second timing meant the difference between life and death. Her hands, once gentle instruments of healing, had become as quick and deadly as Jonas's own. She could draw and fire her custom Colt .45 in less than half a second, a skill that had saved both their lives more times than either cared to count. Jonas bore his own collection of wounds, including a knife scar across his ribs from a fight, with claim jumpers in Nevada and a permanent limp from a fall during a pursuit through the Colorado Rockies. But more than physical damage, the years had etched lines of weariness into his face. The burden of being judge, jury, and executioner across the lawless frontier was taking its toll on both of them. Their partnership had evolved beyond mere cooperation into something deeper and more complex. They could communicate with glances. Across a crowded saloon, coordinate attacks without speaking, and trust each other with their lives in situations where a moment's hesitation meant death. But they had also seen enough of humanity's darkness to understand that their war against injustice might never truly end. The morning that would change everything began like any other. They were camped in the foothills of the San Juan Mountains, following reports of missing wagon trains along the Santa Fe Trail. 7 families had vanished in the past 2 months, their goods found scattered, but their bodies never recovered. Margaret was cleaning her rifle by the fire when the stranger rode into their camp. He was young, perhaps 25, with the soft hands and clean clothes of an eastern city dweller. His horse was expensive but poorly cared for, suggesting he was unaccustomed to frontier travel. "Are you Jonas Clay?" the stranger asked, dismounting. With obvious relief, Jonas nodded warily, his hand never straying far from his weapon. Strangers who sought them out usually brought trouble, either as enemies or as desperate souls seeking help they might not be able to provide. "My name is William Hartwell. I've been searching for you and Miss Whitmore for 6 weeks." Margaret looked up from her rifle, recognizing the name immediately. "Hartwell? Are you related to the Colorado banking family?" "My father owns the Hartwell Trust and Mercantile Company. We have offices in Denver, Santa Fe, and San Francisco." William's voice carried the educated accent of someone who had attended Eastern universities. "What does a banker's son want with us?" Jonas asked bluntly. William reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a thick folder of documents. "My father has a proposition for you, a job that could change the entire territory." Margaret and Jonas exchanged skeptical glances. They had learned to be wary of jobs that promised to change everything. Such offers usually came with complications that made their normal pursuits seem simple by comparison. "We're listening," Margaret said carefully. William spread a detailed map across a flat boulder, weighing down the corners with stones. It showed the entire Colorado territory, with various towns and settlements marked in different colored inks. "Have you heard of the Colorado Mining Consortium?" William asked. Jonas nodded grimly. The consortium was one of the most powerful business organizations in the West, controlling dozens of silver and gold mines across 3 states. They were also rumored to have connections to organized crime, corrupt politicians, and the kind of violence that official law enforcement seemed unable or unwilling to address. 3 months ago, my father was approached by a group of independent miners and small-town mayors, William continued. They claimed the consortium is systematically driving them out of business through intimidation, sabotage, and murder. "The consortium has lawyers and political connections," Margaret observed. "Why come to us instead of working through legal channels?" William's laugh was bitter. "Because the consortium owns most of the legal channels. Judges, sheriffs, territorial officials, they're all either on the payroll or too frightened to act." He pulled out a separate document, this one bearing official seals and signatures. "My father has been authorized by the territorial governor to offer you both official commissions as special territorial marshals, full authority to investigate and arrest anyone connected to these crimes, regardless of their position or connections." Jonas studied the commission papers with growing interest. Legal authority would solve many of the problems they faced in their current work. No more worrying about wanted posters or local sheriffs who might not appreciate their methods. "What's the catch?" Margaret asked, knowing there had to be one. "The consortium is run by a man named Ezra Blackwood. He has over 100 men working for him, including some of the most dangerous killers in the West. Going after him would be like declaring war on a small army." Margaret felt a familiar chill at the name. She had heard stories about Ezra Blackwood, how he had started as a simple claim jumper and built his empire through systematic violence and intimidation. Men who crossed him didn't just disappear. They were made examples of in ways that discouraged others from following their lead. "There's something else," William added reluctantly. Blackwood has put a price on both your heads. $5,000 each, dead or alive. He considers you a threat to his operations even before you've accepted this job." Jonas wrote in his journal and showed the page to Margaret. "We're already at war. Might as well make it official." Margaret nodded. Slowly. They had always known that their activities would eventually attract the attention of someone powerful enough to pose a real threat. Perhaps it was better to face that threat on their own terms, rather than wait for it to find them. "What kind of support would we have?" she asked. William smiled for the first time since entering their camp. "Complete financial backing, access to federal resources, and a network of allies throughout the territory. My father has been building relationships with honest lawmen and business leaders for years, waiting for the right opportunity to move against the consortium." "And ammunition?" Jonas asked. "Unlimited." Margaret looked at the map again, noting the scope of the territory they would be responsible for. It was larger than some eastern states, filled with mining camps, railroad towns, and isolated settlements, where the consortium's influence might be strongest. "How long do we have to decide?" she asked. "Blackwood is planning something big for next month. Our sources suggest he's going to make a major move to consolidate his control over the independent mines. If we're going to stop him, we need to act soon." That evening, after William had departed with promises to return in 3 days for their answer, Jonas and Margaret sat by their fire discussing the proposal. It represented everything they had been working toward, the chance to take on the kind of systematic corruption that individual pursuits could never fully address. But it also meant abandoning the freedom that had defined their partnership. As special marshals, they would be answerable to political authorities, bound by bureaucratic constraints, and operating under public scrutiny that their current methods could never withstand. "Do you think we can trust the banker?" Margaret asked. Jonas wrote, "Money doesn't make men honest, but Blackwood's made enough enemies that Hartwell's motives don't matter. Enemy of our enemy. And if we fail? If Blackwood's organization is too big to fight, then we die trying. Better than running forever." Margaret stared into the flames, seeing reflected there all the battles they had fought and all the people they had helped over the past 3 years. The faces of grateful families, the relief in the eyes of terrorized communities, the satisfaction of seeing justice served where law had failed. "There's something I need to tell you," she said quietly. Jonas looked up from his journal, hearing something in her voice that made him set aside his writing. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from an extinguished candle. Jonas stared at her for a long moment, his weathered face cycling through surprise, joy, and concern in rapid succession. 2 months, Margaret continued. "I've been trying to find the right time to tell you." Jonas reached across the fire and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her palm. For a man who had spent years dispensing violence across the frontier, his touch remained surprisingly tender. "Changes things," he said softly. "Everything," Margaret agreed. They sat in silence for several minutes, both contemplating what this meant for their partnership and their war against injustice. A child would make their dangerous lifestyle impossible to maintain, but it also gave them something they had never considered before, a stake in the future they were trying to build. "The Blackwood job," Jonas said finally. "Our last one?" Margaret nodded. "Our last one. Win or lose, we retire after this." Jonas wrote in his journal, "Good reason to make sure we win." 3 days later, William Hartwell returned to find them packed and ready to travel. Margaret wore the silver star of a special territorial marshal pinned to her jacket, while Jonas had his badge positioned where it would be visible but wouldn't interfere with a quick draw. "You'll do it then?" William asked, relief evident in his voice. "We'll do it," Margaret confirmed. "But we do it our way. No interference from politicians, no second-guessing our methods. And when it's over, we're done," Jonas added. "This badge comes off and we disappear. William nodded eagerly. My father anticipated that condition. There's a ranch in Oregon. Territory, good land near the coast. It would be yours, free and clear, when Blackwood is finished. A ranch in Oregon. Margaret tried to imagine it. A place where she could raise children and Jonas could put down his guns. Where healing would mean tending to injured livestock instead of bullet wounds. And their greatest concern would be weather and crop prices instead of killers in the night. It seemed almost too good to be true, which made her suspect it probably was. But as they rode toward their final confrontation with organized evil, Margaret allowed herself to hope. Hope that they would survive the coming war. Hope that their child would grow up in a world where justice didn't require vigilantes to enforce it. Hope that the legendary partnership of the silent gun and the witch's daughter would end not in violence and death, but in peaceful obscurity and the quiet satisfaction of work well done. The frontier had shaped them, tested them, and forged them into something more powerful than either could have become alone. Now it was time to see if that strength would be enough to defeat the greatest challenge they had ever faced. Ezra Blackwood was waiting somewhere ahead, surrounded by his army of killers and protected by wealth and political connections that had made him untouchable for years. But he had never faced opponents like Jonas Clay and Margaret Whitmore. The final chapter of their legend was about to begin, and the entire Colorado Territory would bear witness to its conclusion. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories. Right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.